The mahogany doors of Clayton Mansion swing open silently, as they have for over a century, revealing rooms draped in velvet and lit by crystal chandeliers. Renaissance paintings hang in gilded frames. Persian rugs muffle footsteps on polished floors. Everything whispers refinement, taste, cultivation. But listen closer. Can you hear it? Beneath the rustle of silk and the clink of champagne glasses, there's another sound, the roar of blast furnaces, the screams of dying men, the crack of rifle fire on a July morning when the Monongahela River ran red with workers' blood. This is Clayton, the Pittsburgh pleasure palace of Henry Clay Frick, and like every monument to Gilded Age magnificence, it was built on a foundation most would rather forget. What price was paid for these Italian marble fireplaces? Whose hands, calloused, bleeding, now forgotten, made possible this sanctuary of beauty? And can a mansion ever escape the sins of the man who built it, or does it remain forever haunted by the ghosts of those he destroyed? The story begins not with grandeur, but with hunger. Henry Clay Frick was born in 1849 into a Pennsylvania family that knew money once but had watched it slip through their fingers like water. His grandfather Abraham Overholt had built a whiskey distillery empire, and the Overholt name meant something in western Pennsylvania. It meant barrels shipped down the Ohio River, it meant quality rye whiskey in saloons from Pittsburgh to St. Louis, it meant money and respectability. But Henry's father, John W. Frick, proved spectacularly unsuited for business, drifting from one failed venture to another with the hapless determination of a man perpetually convinced his next scheme would reverse his fortunes. Young Henry grew up in modest circumstances in West Overton, watching his mother Elizabeth scrimp to make ends meet while his father's dreams evaporated like morning dew. The contrast between the Overholt family's prosperity and his own family's genteel poverty carved something deep into Henry's psyche, a determination so fierce it bordered on pathological, a hunger that could never quite be satisfied. He would not be poor. He would not be forgotten. He would not be another failed Frick. He would claw his way to power, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would stand in his way. At 21, after working as a bookkeeper and saving every penny with miserly intensity, Frick staked everything on a gamble that would define him, coke. Not the powder that would later fuel America's nightclub economy, but the industrial fuel that fed steel furnaces, coal-baked in beehive ovens until it became almost pure carbon, burning hotter and cleaner than anything else available. The process was brutal. Soft coal was loaded into dome-shaped brick ovens and baked at extreme temperatures for 48 to 72 hours. The volatile compounds burned off as waste gases, leaving behind coke, dense, porous, almost pure carbon that could sustain the intense heat necessary for steel production. Pittsburgh's steel industry was exploding in the 1870s, transforming from scattered forges into the industrial colossus that would forge the rails, beams, and bridges of a nation, and it devoured coke by the trainload. Frick borrowed money from relatives and Judge Thomas Mellon, another self-made titan who recognized ambition when he saw it, and built his first battery of coke ovens in the Connellsville region, where the coal was particularly suited for coking. He worked with manic intensity that bordered on mania. He slept 4 hours a night. He inspected every oven personally, his eyes learning to judge by the color and texture of the smoke when a load was perfectly cooked. He drove his workers as brutally as he drove himself, demanding efficiency that squeezed every ounce of productivity from human bodies and industrial processes. The men who worked his ovens labored in conditions that can scarcely be imagined today. They worked 16-hour shifts in temperatures that reached 130 degrees at the oven doors. They breathed air thick with coal dust and sulfurous gases. Their lungs turned black. They developed coke oven consumption, coughing up bloody phlegm, dying in their 40s if they lasted that long. Safety equipment didn't exist. Medical care was whatever a man could afford, which was usually nothing. When a worker was injured or killed, a common occurrence, another desperate man waited to take his place. The labor supply was infinite, immigrants pouring off ships, farmers abandoning depleted land, freedmen fleeing the South, all willing to work any job, endure any hardship, for the chance to survive in industrial America. Frick didn't care about their suffering. Or rather, he cared only insofar as it affected productivity. A dead worker was an efficiency problem, not a moral crisis. This wasn't unusual cruelty for the era, it was standard operating procedure among industrialists who genuinely believed that market forces, not sentiment, should govern labor relations. Social Darwinism was the reigning intellectual fashion, teaching that competition naturally sorted the fit from the unfit, that poverty indicated moral or genetic inferiority, that interference with market mechanisms was both futile and dangerous. In this worldview, Frick's success proved his superiority. The workers' suffering proved theirs. And it worked, at least by the metrics Frick valued. By 30, in 1879, he was a millionaire, exactly as he'd vowed when still a teenager. He controlled thousands of coke ovens and supplied most of Pittsburgh's steel mills. That million had been extracted from men whose names we'll never know, whose graves are unmarked, whose children grew up fatherless. But it was $1 million, and in 1879 America, that made Henry Clay Frick a prince. In 1881, Henry Clay Frick married Adelaide Howard Childs, the daughter of Asa P. Childs, a prosperous Pittsburgh manufacturer of boot and shoe findings. Adelaide was everything Frick was not: cultured, refined, educated in the arts and literature, socially graceful where he was stiff and awkward. She was refined where he was ruthless, cultivated where he was calculating, but she saw something in this intense young coke magnate, perhaps the wounded boy beneath the armor of ambition, perhaps the capacity for tenderness he rarely displayed to the world, or perhaps simply the intoxicating promise of wealth and the social position it could purchase. Their wedding portrait shows them both young and luminous, Adelaide in elaborate white lace and orange blossoms, Henry almost handsome in formal attire, his habitually hard mouth softened slightly by what might be love or might be satisfaction at having acquired the perfect ornament for his ambitions, a woman whose gentility could civilize his rough edges and give his fortune the patina of culture. Within a year, they needed a home befitting Frick's rising status. In 1882, he purchased Clayton, an 11-room Italianate house on Penn Avenue in the East End neighborhood of Point Breeze, a fashionable area where Pittsburgh's industrial elite were building their estates, for $25,000. It was respectable but modest, suitable for a successful businessman but not for a titan. Far too modest for what Frick intended to become. He immediately began plans to transform it into something that would announce his arrival among Pittsburgh's first families. But first, business. In 1882, Andrew Carnegie, already the undisputed king of steel, a man who'd risen from Scottish immigrant poverty to industrial dominance, offered Frick a partnership. Carnegie had been watching Frick's operations with admiration and perhaps envy. Here was a man even more ruthless than Carnegie himself, a man without Carnegie's need to be liked or his pretensions to democratic ideals. Carnegie recognized in Frick something he valued above all else: absolute ruthlessness married to organizational genius, a willingness to make decisions that would horrify softer men. Carnegie supplied vision, technological innovation, and public charm. Frick supplied coke, operational management, and a steely determination to do whatever was necessary to crush competitors and control labor. It was a partnership forged in hellfire, and for a decade it dominated American industry, growing into the largest, most profitable steel operation the world had ever seen. The money poured in, rivers of it, oceans of it, more money than men like Frick's father could have imagined in their wildest dreams, more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. At Clayton, the transformation began in earnest. Frick hired Frederick J. Osterling, one of Pittsburgh's most fashionable architects, to design a massive expansion that would transform the modest residence into a showplace. The project took years and cost a fortune. Exact figures are lost, but estimates suggest well over $100,000, an astronomical sum in 1890s dollars. The modest 11 rooms became 23. An entire second floor was added, with bedrooms for family and guests. The third floor became servants' quarters and children's spaces. The facade was rebuilt in a riot of Victorian excess that announced wealth from the street: towers and turrets, elaborate carved trim, fish-scale shingles, a porte-cochere where carriages could shelter visitors from the weather, asserting that people of quality arrived here. Inside, rooms were paneled in rare woods sourced from around the world: Santo Domingo mahogany with its rich red-brown glow, Italian walnut carefully matched for grain patterns, Swiss pear wood carved by master craftsmen into fantastical patterns of flowers, vines, and geometric designs. The entry hall featured a massive reception space with an elaborate carved oak staircase, its newel post topped with an electric light fixture, electricity itself still a luxury that most Pittsburgh homes lacked in the 1890s. The dining room became a shrine to conspicuous consumption, featuring a hand-painted ceiling depicting the four seasons, each panel a masterpiece of decorative art executed by Italian craftsmen, overlooked by carved wooden panels and lit by a chandelier that cost more than a worker earned in 5 years. The morning room, Adelaide's personal space, was decorated in lighter tones, cream and gold, with delicate furniture and windows that caught the morning sun. Here she would write letters, read, and manage household affairs away from Henry's intense presence. The library, Henry's domain, was fitted with built-in bookcases of carved mahogany, a massive desk, leather chairs, and eventually lined with books, some read, many purchased by the yard for their impressive bindings. This was where Frick conducted business from home, where he made decisions that affected thousands of lives, where he calculated costs and profits with the precision he'd learned as a bookkeeper. The ceiling featured an elaborate plaster medallion, the fireplace was Italian marble. Every detail announced permanence, solidity, unshakable success. Everywhere, the message was clear: I have arrived. I have conquered. I am untouchable. I am not my father. The house required infrastructure unimaginable in earlier eras. A heating system with a massive coal-fired furnace in the basement sent steam through iron radiators to every room. Gas lights were being replaced by electric fixtures, powered by one of Pittsburgh's new generating stations. Frick was always an early adopter of technology that enhanced comfort or projected modernity. The kitchen, located in the basement to keep cooking smells and heat away from family spaces, was a warren of storerooms, preparation areas, and a massive coal-fired range where cooks produced the elaborate multi-course meals expected in houses like this. A dumbwaiter lifted food to the butler's pantry, where it would be plated and served by footmen. Bathrooms featured the latest porcelain fixtures and indoor plumbing, luxuries that most Americans still lacked. A telephone was installed, connecting Frick to his business empire and his social circle. Every modern convenience that money could buy was incorporated into Clayton, making it not just a showplace but a genuinely comfortable residence for the family. By 1892, Clayton was complete, and the Frick family, Henry, Adelaide, and their children Childs, Martha, and baby Helen, moved into rooms designed to showcase not just wealth but a very particular vision of civilization. Henry had begun collecting art with the same ferocious determination he brought to business. Not for him the slow, careful education of taste through years of study and contemplation. He bought on instinct, gut feeling, and the advice of dealers who quickly learned what appealed to him: old masters, established reputations, paintings that combined aesthetic merit with investment value. Gainsborough, Rembrandt, Vermeer, these names would eventually fill his New York mansion, purchased for sums that made headlines, but the seeds were planted at Clayton. The walls bloomed with gilt frames containing European paintings, each one a declaration that Henry Clay Frick had transcended his origins, that he was not merely rich but cultured, not merely powerful but refined. Adelaide, who genuinely loved music and literature and had been raised in a household that valued cultural pursuits, filled the house with sounds that softened its hard commercial edges. She played piano in the music room, not the showy virtuosity of a concert performer but the accomplished amateur skill of a well-educated woman. She read voraciously, novels, poetry, history, biography, and encouraged her children to do the same. She entertained Pittsburgh's cultural elite, musicians, artists, academics, and the wives of other industrialists, creating a social world that revolved around artistic appreciation rather than mere business. On the surface, Clayton embodied the American dream made manifest: a self-made man who'd clawed his way from poverty to plenty, a cultured wife who graced his success with genuine refinement, beautiful children, a house that testified to what talent and hard work could achieve in a land of opportunity. But beneath the surface, something rotted. Because 1892 was also the year of Homestead. 7 miles from Clayton's perfumed drawing rooms, down the Monongahela River in a valley choked with industrial smoke, stood the Homestead Steel Works, a sprawling complex covering hundreds of acres where 3,800 men worked in conditions that would shock modern sensibilities into disbelief. The steel mill was hell made manifest on earth, blast furnaces that topped 2,000 degrees, tall as buildings and hungry as demons, molten metal that could incinerate a man in seconds if he stumbled, machinery that crushed and maimed with casual indifference, rollers that could catch a sleeve and pull a worker to his death, air so thick with smoke and metallic particulates that workers coughed black phlegm for years afterward and died young of lung diseases that had no names yet. The noise was deafening, the clang of steel on steel, the roar of furnaces, the hiss of steam, the shouts of men trying to communicate above the industrial cacophony. The heat was unbearable, especially in summer when men worked shifts in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees, drinking gallons of water and still collapsing from heat exhaustion. The men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week during busy periods, which was most of the time. Many earned between $1.50 and $2.50 per day, barely enough to feed a family, impossible for saving. Skilled workers, the rolling mill men, the puddlers, the heaters who required years of experience, made more, perhaps $5 or even $7 per day, enough to achieve a precarious respectability, to rent a house instead of a room, to dream of their children having better lives. They lived in company-owned housing or cramped tenements in Homestead and nearby Munhall, shopped at company stores where prices were inflated, and understood with perfect clarity that they were expendable. When one man fell, to heat, to injury, to machines that didn't care, another desperate worker waited outside the gates to take his place. There was always another worker. The supply was infinite. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had organized some of Homestead's skilled workers, not the unskilled laborers, who were considered unorganizable, but the craftsmen whose expertise gave them minimal bargaining power. Their contract was set to expire in June 1892. The union wanted fair wages that kept pace with the company's massive profits. They wanted safety improvements to reduce the horrifying injury and death rates. They wanted to be treated as human beings with dignity and worth, not as interchangeable parts in Carnegie's profit-making machine. They wanted recognition that their skill and labor created the wealth that built mansions like Clayton, and that they deserved a fair share. Henry Clay Frick, chairman of Carnegie Steel Company and Andrew Carnegie's designated enforcer, had other ideas. He wanted to break the union completely, to establish once and for all that capital, not labor, controlled the terms of employment. He wanted to reduce wages by 18 to 26% depending on position. He wanted to eliminate the union's power to negotiate, to reduce skilled workers to the same powerless position as the unskilled masses. He saw the union not as a legitimate representative of workers' interests but as an illegitimate interference with management's absolute right to run its business as it saw fit. And Carnegie, who publicly claimed to support workers' rights and had written essays about the dignity of labor and the obligations of wealth, Carnegie gave Frick carte blanche to handle the situation his way, then conveniently left for a vacation in Scotland, positioning himself to escape blame for whatever happened next. It was the same pattern Carnegie followed repeatedly: proclaim progressive principles while empowering men like Frick to violate them, then express shock at the unfortunate outcomes he'd tacitly authorized. What happened next was a massacre, a battle, a turning point in American labor history that would echo for generations. Frick announced wage cuts in May. The union refused. Negotiations were theater. Frick had no intention of compromising. On June 29, Frick locked the workers out of the plant entirely, refusing them entry. Then he began transforming the Homestead Works into a fortress. He erected a fence around the entire 3-mile perimeter of the plant, 12 feet high, made of wood and barbed wire, topped with searchlights, and punctuated with rifle holes for guards to shoot through. The workers, with bitter humor, called it Fort Frick. It was an act of war against his own employees, and they understood it as such. Then, in absolute secrecy, Frick hired 300 Pinkerton agents, essentially a private army of strikebreakers, thugs, and desperate men willing to do violence for pay. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had made its reputation breaking strikes and crushing unions across America, and its agents were feared and hated by working people. The plan was simple: float 2 barges of Pinkertons down the Monongahela River under cover of darkness, land them at the plant, secure the facilities, and reopen with strikebreakers while the Pinkertons kept the Union men at bay with force. At 4 in the morning on July 6, 1892, the 2 barges carrying 300 armed Pinkertons floated down the dark river toward Homestead. But the workers were waiting. Someone, the identity was never discovered, though Frick suspected Union leadership, had tipped them off. As the barges approached the plant landing, thousands of steelworkers and their families lined the riverbank. Men, women, and children stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the dark shapes approach. What happened next depends on which side tells the story, but the outcome is undisputed: a firefight erupted that would last 14 hours and leave 10 men dead. Who fired first? The Pinkertons claimed the workers shot at them as they tried to land. The workers claimed the Pinkertons fired into the crowd without provocation. Probably both sides fired nearly simultaneously. Fear and tension exploding into violence at the first movement. What's certain is that hell erupted on the Monongahela. Workers fired rifles and pistols from the shore. Pinkertons returned fire from the barges with Winchester repeating rifles. Bullets thudded into wood, ricocheted off metal, punched through flesh. Men screamed. Blood pooled on the barges and the riverbank. Someone poured oil on the river and tried to set it alight, hoping to burn the barges. Workers loaded an ancient Civil War cannon with railroad spikes and fired it at the barges, hoping to hold them below the waterline. They threw dynamite, though most of it failed to explode. They built barricades of steel beams and slag piles and fought like soldiers defending their homes, which, in a sense, they were. The battle raged through the morning and into the afternoon. 3 Pinkertons died: T.J. Connors, Edward Spear, and J.W. Klein, their names recorded in company reports as casualties of duty, though they were mercenaries attacking workers. 7 workers died: Joseph Sotak, Henry Striegel, George Rutter, John E. Morris, Peter Fairs, Silas Wayne, and an 18-year-old boy named Mikulas who'd come to America dreaming of opportunity and was shot in the head on a Pennsylvania riverbank. Dozens more were wounded on both sides, flesh torn by bullets, bones shattered, lives permanently altered. By 5 in the afternoon, the Pinkertons surrendered. They raised white flags and negotiated safe passage ashore. The Union leaders promised their safety. But when the Pinkertons landed and began marching through Homestead toward the train station, all promises dissolved. They ran a gauntlet of fury. Thousands of workers and their wives and children lined the route, driven mad by grief and rage. They beat the Pinkertons with fists, clubs, stones, tools, anything they could grab. Women struck them with umbrellas, their faces twisted with hate. Men who'd watched friends die that morning kicked and punched these hired guns who'd come to steal their livelihoods. The Pinkertons stumbled through miles of violence, some beaten unconscious, all bloodied, lucky to reach the trains with their lives. The workers had won the battle. They would lose the war. Pennsylvania's Governor Robert Pattison, after initially trying to mediate, sent in 8,000 National Guard troops to occupy Homestead and break the strike. The soldiers arrived with full military equipment, rifles, artillery, supply trains, and occupied the town like a conquered city. Martial law was effectively declared. The Union could not fight the state. Frick, who'd remained in his Pittsburgh office throughout the battle, refused all negotiations, all compromise, all appeals to reason or mercy. His position was absolute: surrender unconditionally or starve. Within weeks, hungry and desperate, some workers began accepting Frick's terms and returning to work. Within months, the Union was destroyed, its leaders blacklisted throughout the industry, its members scattered or broken. Wages were slashed even more severely than Frick had initially proposed. Work hours increased. Conditions worsened. Safety standards, already abysmal, declined further because there was no one to demand better. The message was clear and had been sent not just to Homestead but to every worker in America: resist, and we will crush you. Your families will suffer. You will be erased. Your very existence is conditional on your obedience. The steel mills of Pittsburgh would remain non-union for the next 40 years, a direct result of what happened at Homestead in the summer of 1892. Entire generations of steelworkers would labor without the protection of collective bargaining, without the ability to negotiate for better wages or safer conditions, because of what Henry Clay Frick did that July. And Frick, orchestrator of it all, became the most hated man in America, his name synonymous with capitalist brutality, his face caricatured in newspapers as a grinning demon standing on piles of workers' corpses. How hated? Hated enough to kill. On July 23, 1892, just 17 days after the Homestead battle, a young Russian Jewish anarchist named Alexander Berkman entered Frick's Pittsburgh office on the second floor of the Chronicle Telegraph Building. Berkman was 21 years old, an idealistic revolutionary who believed that killing tyrants would spark the revolution that would free the working class. He saw Frick as the perfect target, the personification of everything wrong with capitalism, a man whose death would be both justice and inspiration. Berkman pulled out a revolver and shot Frick 3 times at point-blank range, bullets hitting him in the neck and back. Frick, incredibly, did not die. He collapsed but remained conscious. As Berkman tried to shoot again, the revolver jammed. He pulled out a sharpened file and stabbed Frick in the leg repeatedly. Office workers rushed in and wrestled Berkman to the ground while he bit and fought and tried to reach a dynamite cap in his mouth that he'd planned to detonate if captured. And Frick, this is the detail that became legend, Frick refused anesthetic while doctors dug 3 bullets from his neck and back at his desk. He feared the anesthetic would dull his mind or appear weak. He bit on a cloth and endured the agony conscious. Then, still bleeding, he worked a full day at his desk, finishing contracts and signing papers. Only then did he allow himself to be taken home to Clayton, where Adelaide had waited in terror after hearing the news. He recovered within weeks. The assassination attempt, which should have made Frick a villain in any sane world, instead transformed him into a hero in the eyes of America's propertied classes and much of the public. Here was a man who literally took bullets and refused to yield, who put duty above safety, who embodied courage and principle. Sympathy flooded in from across the country and around the world. The strike, which had had public support and newspaper backing, turned decisively against the workers. They were now associated with anarchist violence, with attempted murder, with dangerous radicalism. Berkman went to prison for 14 years, emerging broken. The workers, who'd had nothing to do with Berkman's attack, nevertheless bore the blame. Frick's reputation, paradoxically, improved. He was now not just a business leader but a hero who'd survived an assassin's bullets. The irony was complete. At Clayton, life continued in gilded isolation. Did Adelaide understand what her husband had done? Did she lie awake at night in their mahogany 4-poster bed thinking of the widows and orphans her husband's decisions had created, the 7 families in Homestead who would never see their men again? Or did she, like so many of her class and era, accept that the world was harsh and hierarchical, that some people were born to rule and others to serve, that her husband's genius and determination naturally entitled him to wealth while the workers' poverty reflected their own inadequacy? Did she believe, as respectable opinion taught, that unions were dangerous socialist conspiracies that threatened American prosperity? We cannot know. Her letters are carefully proper, avoiding political controversy. What we do know is that tragedy entered Clayton through other doors, visiting suffering on the Fricks themselves in ways that money could not prevent. In 1891, 6-year-old Martha, a beautiful child with dark curls and bright intelligence, died suddenly of a fever. The house went into deep mourning. Henry, who loved his children in his own fierce, inarticulate way, perhaps the only thing he loved without calculation, was devastated in a way his business setbacks had never touched him. Then, in 1892, that terrible year when Homestead bloodied his reputation and Berkman's bullets found him, in that same cursed year, their infant son Henry Clay Frick Jr. died at just weeks old, barely having drawn breath in this world. 2 children gone within a year. Adelaide retreated into grief and religious devotion, attending church services with the fervor of someone seeking either comfort or answers to questions too terrible to speak aloud. Henry retreated into work and art collecting, his 2 mechanisms for controlling a universe that had demonstrated it could not be controlled even by a man of his iron will. He could not bring back his children. He could not make Adelaide stop grieving. But he could acquire a Vermeer. He could crush a competitor. He could transform pain into mastery in the only domains where he still wielded absolute power. The contrast between Clayton's interior life and the world outside its walls grew starker with each passing year. While the Fricks dined on 9-course meals served by liveried footmen on Limoges china, oysters, soup, fish, sorbet, roasted meat, salad, dessert, fruit, cheese, workers' families survived on bread and broth, stretching pennies to feed children who never quite had enough. While Adelaide played Chopin in the music room, workers' widows took in washing and mending, their hands raw from lye soap, trying to feed children whose fathers had died at homestead. While Henry acquired paintings worth more than his workers would earn in 10 lifetimes of labor, those same workers toiled in conditions that permanently damaged their bodies and minds, dying of silicosis and industrial accidents and sheer exhaustion in their 40s and 50s, decades before their natural spans should have ended. The servants who made Clayton function, the small army of human labor required to maintain a house like this, were almost invisible in family records, their names and stories erased by the assumption that service was a natural condition for the lower orders, that some people were simply born to cook and clean and fetch for others. How many worked at Clayton? Employment records suggest 20 to 30 at various times: cooks, kitchen maids, parlor maids, chambermaids, a laundress, a butler, footmen, coachmen, grooms, gardeners, possibly a lady's maid for Adelaide and a governess for the children. They lived in small, plain rooms on the 4th floor, spaces carefully designed to be invisible from the public rooms, accessible by back stairs so servants could move through the house without being seen. What were their lives like? Did they resent the wealth surrounding them, or did proximity to it somehow compensate for their own poverty? Did they steal food from the kitchen to supplement inadequate pay? Did they gossip about the Fricks' private lives, mock their pretensions, judge the household that employed them? Or did they, for the most part, accept their positions as decent work in a harsh economy, grateful for steady employment and perhaps even developing loyalty to a family that treated them fairly by the standards of the time? We barely know, because people like the Fricks didn't consider such questions worth asking, didn't think to preserve the stories of people they considered fundamentally different from themselves. In 1905, the Fricks left Clayton for New York, where Henry was constructing an even grander mansion on 5th Avenue at 70th Street. Pittsburgh had served its purpose, it had made him unimaginably wealthy, one of the richest men in America, but New York represented the ultimate prize, entry into the highest echelons of American society, proximity to the Vanderbilts and Astors and Morgans, recognition not just as a provincial industrialist but as a national figure. Clayton was left in the hands of daughter Helen, now a young woman, who lived there intermittently while managing her father's Pittsburgh interests. Henry devoted his remaining years to art collecting on an unprecedented scale, amassing a collection that would rival those of European aristocrats. The Fifth Avenue mansion became a temple to European masterpieces: Vermeer, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Bellini, El Greco, Titian, Goya, Holbein, Franz Hals. He paid $125,000 for a single Rembrandt, more than he'd paid for Clayton itself. Each painting represented not just aesthetic appreciation but a kind of secular immortality, a way of saying, I may have been a ruthless industrialist, but look, I preserved beauty for future generations. I was a patron of civilization, not merely a destroyer of men. I transcended my origins. I will be remembered for culture, not coke ovens. Did Frick believe this narrative? Probably. The human capacity for self-justification is limitless, especially among the powerful who need to believe their success reflects virtue rather than violence. Frick genuinely loved art. His aesthetic taste, educated by the best dealers and advisors money could buy, became impeccable. He could discourse knowledgeably about Flemish technique and Renaissance composition, about attribution questions and provenance. In his own mind, he had transcended his brutal origins, had evolved from Coke king to culture baron, had achieved not just wealth but refinement, not just power but taste. The irony, the tragic, damning irony that he could never see or acknowledge, is that every painting, every sculpture, every objet d'art in his collection was purchased with money extracted from men whose lives were destroyed to produce it. The Vermeers were bought with homestead blood. The Rembrandts represented unpaid wages and blacklisted workers. The mansion itself was built on a foundation of crushed unions and broken bodies. His entire aesthetic legacy rested on human suffering he never adequately acknowledged or atoned for. Frick died in 1919, age 70, in his Fifth Avenue palace, surrounded by masterpieces and family. His fortune was estimated at over $100 million, roughly $1.5 billion in today's dollars, though probably more given the difficulty of converting asset values across a century. His will transformed the Fifth Avenue mansion into a public museum, the Frick Collection, which opened to the public in 1935 and remains one of New York's premier art institutions. His stated goal was to give the public access to great art, to educate and elevate future generations through exposure to beauty and culture. Noble words from a man who'd spent his life extracting maximum value from workers while giving minimum compensation. But what kind of education do these paintings provide? When visitors stand before Frick's Vermeers in quiet contemplation, do they think about the steelworkers who made their acquisition possible? When they admire the mansion's impeccable taste, do they hear the ghosts of homestead rattling behind the walls? Or does the beauty successfully erase the brutality, allowing us to appreciate art while conveniently forgetting its origins, to admire the flower while ignoring the manure from which it grew? Back in Pittsburgh, Clayton passed to Helen Clay Frick, who never married and devoted her extraordinary life to preserving her father's legacy, though notably, a carefully curated version of that legacy. Helen was a formidable woman, vastly more than a dutiful daughter. She was highly educated, earning a degree from Bryn Mawr, and became genuinely passionate about art, history, and historic preservation. She understood that Clayton represented not just a family home but a historical document of Gilded Age life, one of the few surviving examples of how the industrial elite actually lived. While other mansions were demolished for development, Helen fought to preserve Clayton intact, maintaining it with meticulous attention to detail. But her version of that history emphasized the aesthetic and cultural achievements, the art collection, the architectural innovations, the family's cultural sophistication, while remaining largely silent about homestead, about labor violence, about the human cost of her father's fortune. When Clayton eventually opened to the public as a museum in 1990, following Helen's death in 1984 at age 96 and years of meticulous restoration by the Frick Pittsburgh, the early tours focused almost exclusively on architectural details, art collections, and family life. Homestead was mentioned, if at all, as an unfortunate labor dispute that had been blown out of proportion by anarchists and radical agitators. This sanitized history was not unique to Clayton. Across America, Gilded Age mansions were being transformed into museums throughout the 20th century, and the standard narrative emphasized vision, genius, entrepreneurial daring, and cultural contribution while minimizing or ignoring exploitation, violence, injustice, and the brutal realities of industrial capitalism. The robber barons were being systematically rebranded as captains of industry. Ruthless monopolists became pioneering entrepreneurs. Men who crushed unions and destroyed lives became philanthropists whose generosity built libraries, universities, concert halls, and museums. Carnegie libraries blanket America, each one built with steel profits extracted from workers who couldn't afford to buy the books inside them. Rockefeller's Standard Oil fortune, built through monopoly and cutthroat competition, funded universities and medical research. The transformation of reputation is perhaps the ultimate power of wealth, the ability not just to shape the present but to rewrite history itself, to ensure that your crimes are forgotten while your charity is remembered, to buy not just luxury but legacy. But history has a way of reasserting uncomfortable truths, especially in eras when inequality again becomes impossible to ignore. In recent decades, as America has experienced levels of wealth concentration not seen since the Gilded Age itself, institutions like the Frick Pittsburgh have begun to grapple more honestly with the complex, troubling legacy of their founders. Tours now mention Homestead explicitly, not as an unfortunate footnote but as a defining event that reveals essential truths about how Frick's fortune was built. Educational programs discuss the Gilded Age's stark inequality, the brutal labor conflicts, the human costs of industrialization. Curators have worked to recover the stories of Clayton's servants, the invisible people who cooked Frick's meals and washed his linens and raised his children, whose labor made possible the Frick's life of leisure and cultural refinement. This shift reflects a broader cultural reckoning with the costs of American capitalism's most brutal period, a growing recognition that admiring the gilded surface requires acknowledging the darkness beneath, that celebrating industrial progress demands also mourning its casualties. Walking through Clayton today is a disorienting, unsettling experience that resists simple interpretation. The house is stunningly preserved, perhaps the finest, most authentic example of a Gilded Age family home in America. Unlike houses that have been stripped and refurnished with period pieces, Clayton contains the Fricks' actual possessions, their actual furniture, the actual objects they touched and used and lived with. Adelaide's morning room still contains her personal effects, her writing desk with its cubbyholes and drawers, her books, novels by George Eliot and poetry by Browning, photographs of her children in silver frames, watercolors she painted herself. The children's playroom on the third floor holds antique toys and furniture scaled for small bodies, heartbreaking reminders of Martha and baby Henry who died so young, whose brief lives are preserved in photographs and mourning rituals but who never got to grow up in these rooms designed for their comfort. The dining room table is set with Limoges china and baccarat crystal, Gorham silver and Irish linen, as though the family might return at any moment for dinner. The aesthetic achievement is undeniable. Standing in the mahogany-paneled library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and bronze sculptures and paintings whose gilt frames glow in carefully controlled lighting, you can understand the seductive power of this life, the appeal of surrounding yourself with beautiful objects and insulating yourself from a harsh world with layers of luxury and refinement. But step outside Clayton's velvet cocoon, drive 7 miles to what remains of the Homestead Steel Works, and the contrast becomes unbearable, physically nauseating. Where thousands once worked and 10 men died, only a shopping center stands now, the waterfront, featuring Target and Best Buy and restaurants serving casual dining, the blast furnaces demolished, the mills torn down, the workers' stories mostly forgotten by everyone except a few local historians and the descendants who still live in the area. A small historical marker commemorates the 1892 battle, offering a brief, sanitized summary for anyone who bothers to stop and read. Few do. The river flows on, indifferent, its waters long since cleaned of industrial pollution, now reflecting sky and clouds as though nothing terrible ever happened here. The men who died there, on both sides, because the Pinkertons were working class too, desperate enough to take dangerous jobs breaking strikes for men richer than they could imagine, are reduced to statistics and names on lists, their individual lives and loves and losses erased by time and collective amnesia. Who remembers Joseph Sotak or Henry Striegel now? Who visits their graves or honors their sacrifice or teaches their children's children about what happened on that July morning? So what is Clayton, really? Is it a testament to vision and taste, or a monument to blood money? Is it a valuable historical resource that educates us about our past, or a sanitized lie that allows us to admire beauty while forgetting the brutality that purchased it? The answer, uncomfortable and irreducible as it is both. Clayton is all of these things simultaneously, a material artifact of impossible beauty that crystallizes the central moral question of capitalism. Can wealth built on exploitation be redeemed by how it's spent? Can art and culture atone for violence and injustice? Or do the sins of acquisition forever stain even the most beautiful objects, rendering them complicit in the crimes that purchased them? Does blood wash off velvet, or does it soak in permanently, invisible but indelible? These are not abstract philosophical questions fit only for academic seminars. They remain urgently relevant in our own age of staggering inequality, when billionaires fund museums and libraries and foundations while their workers qualify for food stamps and public assistance, when corporations tout charitable donations and sustainability initiatives while fighting tooth and nail against living wages and unions, when wealth is presented as evidence of virtue rather than questioned as a possible consequence of exploitation. The logic that justified Frick's actions, that unfettered capitalism produces prosperity, that wealth naturally flows to the talented and deserving, that workers' demands must be crushed to preserve economic freedom, that unions are obstacles to progress rather than protections for dignity, remains disturbingly alive in contemporary politics and economics. We may have OSHA regulations and minimum wage laws and prohibitions against private armies shooting workers, but the fundamental power imbalance between capital and labor, the assumption that owners' rights supersede workers' needs, the belief that efficiency and profit justify almost any human cost, these remain embedded in our economic system and cultural values. Henry Clay Frick is dead, his body long since returned to dust, but the questions he embodied remain alive and urgent. What obligations do the wealthy owe to those whose labor creates their wealth? Is inequality an unfortunate but inevitable feature of capitalism, or a moral catastrophe that demands redress? Should we admire the self-made billionaire as a hero of free enterprise, or question how their billions were extracted from workers who remain poor? When we tour mansion museums, are we celebrating achievement or sanitizing exploitation? And can we hold both truths simultaneously? That these men built great things and destroyed lives, that they preserved beauty and crushed dignity, that they were both visionaries and villains. Clayton stands in Point Breeze still, its facade perfect, its rooms immaculate, its collections priceless, waiting for visitors who will make their own judgments about what it represents. Some will see only beauty and genius, the triumph of taste over chaos, the worthy fruits of exceptional talent and determination, proof that America rewards those who work hardest and dream biggest. Others will see blood disguised as velvet, exploitation hidden behind culture, a monument to everything wrong with unchecked capitalism, evidence that wealth concentrates through violence rather than virtue. Both will be right, because Clayton is large enough to contain both truths, because human beings and their monuments are complex and contradictory, because beauty and brutality can coexist in the same space, purchased with the same money, justified by the same man who genuinely loved art and ruthlessly destroyed workers and saw no contradiction between these positions. Henry Clay Frick's ultimate legacy is not resolution but irresolvable tension, not an answer but an enduring question mark that hangs over every beautiful object and asks, again and again, in every generation, what price beauty? What price civilization? What price culture? And who, in the end, pays it? The mansion cannot answer. It can only pose the question with devastating material clarity: here is beauty. Here is luxury. Here is art preserved for the ages. And here, 7 miles away, is where men died so this could exist. Decide for yourself what that means. Decide for yourself whether the beauty justifies the cost, whether the culture redeems the crime, whether we should preserve these monuments or tear them down, celebrate these men or condemn them. Clayton doesn't solve this dilemma. It embodies it. And that, perhaps, is the most valuable education it can provide, not inspiration, but uncomfortable truth.